Hello, this is the last video of LO4 and we're kind of taking it back a little bit to LO3 because we're talking about information and in particular some characteristics of information, of which we have three main ones we need to look at. And so it's not really security, but it is still an important consideration because when we are collecting information, especially from sources we might consider secondary research sources, so things like search engines are an example of secondary rather than primary research because we're not directly getting the information, we are using a service like Google to access information. That is not us doing it directly, hence why we say it's secondary. We need to be considering factors like who are the sources, where are we getting the information from. If you are, say, collecting information about a scientific event, speaking to a scientist who was involved is going to be a very good source. Speaking to a random person who's got no idea what you're talking about is obviously not. And this can also be an organization. Maybe you are writing a story about a company, and so speaking to a representative of the company will be a good source as opposed to a bad one. But you will need to consider their agenda or point of view. So this is what they're trying to get across. Maybe if your story about the company is a bad one, it's going to reflect quite badly on the company. The person you speak to may lie to you, may not be totally honest, because their agenda is to try and protect themselves and protect the company. So this aspect of having an agenda may lead to bias, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. What's also important is the timeliness and how recent your information is, how up to date it is. Perhaps since it was published, there have been some changes which are going to affect how useful it is to you. So this website is The Guardian, and The Guardian is a newspaper company, and they now on their website let you know if their article is a little bit old, to make sure you're not affected by reading old information which actually is a bit out of date potentially. I always am quite suspicious if I use information without a date on it. I want to know when the information was published, otherwise I can't really tell how recent it is. And this will of course affect how accurate the information is, how correct the information is. If it's really, really old and things have changed, then it may not be accurate. It may have been accurate at the time, but isn't accurate anymore. But generally speaking, you want to be able to verify information. Ideally, you are not relying on only one source. Ideally, you'll be able to back it up with a second source. And two sources may sort of enable you to filter out any issues of bias. So accuracy also does feed into a couple of our three characteristics. The first of which is validity, and so we want our data to be valid. So validity refers to how believable the information is. So for example, clearly some information is going to be more believable than others. If you go onto a random blog on someone's website and they're talking about some conspiracy theory, some crazy sounding idea which doesn't seem very true, that is not likely to be considered a valid source because the information is not very believable. And this relies clearly on your common sense to an extent, but also you may be able to do some investigating and figure out who is the source here, what agenda have they got, and are they likely to be knowledgeable in this area. And if you spot some inaccuracy in this information, you're going to start to doubt that it is a valid source. So accuracy also can feed into reliability. So reliability is referring to how easily it can be verified. And in some cases, if it's breaking information, you may not be able to verify it straight away, so you may look to see if the source has a reputation for accurate information. Certain companies, certain journalists, certain people have got good reputations. You can look back at their past work and see that actually they're usually very reliable, and so you may trust their latest information. But ideally, you'll be able to look at another source and verify it, which means finding another source which backs up your first source. Again, if there is some issue with accuracy, you're going to not consider the source to be reliable. Some information could be valid but not reliable. For example, fake news you may have heard of, where people will create fake articles which sound quite realistic, which sound quite believable, but actually once you look into them you realise they're actually not true, and so they'd be valid maybe but not reliable. Likewise, if there was a huge story which you didn't believe at first sight, but actually it came from a very reliable source, that might be reliable but not valid. Although usually if it is reliable, it is also valid. And our third characteristic we need to look at is bias, which I mentioned before. So information is biased when the source is only giving one perspective, or they're letting their own agenda, their own opinion, influence the information. So some sources are designed to be quite neutral and are not giving any personal opinion, but other sources rely much more on opinion and trying to get a certain view across, which would potentially leave the information being biased, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Although usually when we say something's biased, that tends to mean it's a bad thing, because of course we want to be able to give our opinions. Something like a blog, giving opinions is a really good medium for it. A blog is good for opinions, but if you're using it and need to rely on the information, perhaps bias is going to cause some issues. So these characteristics are not really in order, but I have labelled them 1, 2 and 3 because in my mind at least, if you are assessing the quality of information, you might sort of work your way up. So first of all, look at the information. Is it believable? Does it seem realistic? Then if it is, maybe you check out the background, you check to see if it is reliable. And finally, you may examine it more closely to see if you can spot any issues with maybe there being some opinion which needs to be filtered out.